Amie's work, mostly film work, has been exhibited in many shows worldwide at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, most recently at the Whitney, CCA Waters, also in Berlin at the Quarry once, in Kunstmuseum Stuttgart and Hayward Gallery in London, just to name a few. She has also been in Berlin through the DAD, so which was also related to some film that you produced later, Provenance, and was also a fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation. A number of her works actually address architecture quite directly, or takes architecture as a starting point. One is Provenance, which describes a kind of journey of Le Corbusier's and Pierre Jeanret's furniture that they produced for Chandigarh. Then more recently, you did The Architects, which describes the functioning of the current global architecture office in New York.
Or the dysfunction.
Or dysfunction, yeah, it looks very dysfunctional, that's true, but it's highly efficient though. Then very recently, Double Negative, a kind of description or investigation of the Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier and its Black Double in Canberra, which I'm not sure whether it has been shown or projected already.
It was just at Frieze last week, and then in London, and it'll be at the Villa Stuck in Munich in March. And
for Wohnungsfrage, you actually did two works, not only Quarry, the film, but also Love Letters, a book that was published in the frame of the publication series that we did for Wohnungsfrage. We want to discuss both contributions to the show, and we'll probably start with Quarry. The images are also there. You see that this is incredibly sophisticated.
Is it possible though to bring the light down a little bit on the screen? Because it's quite brutally washed out.
To bring the light down on the screen a bit?
Or even a little on us. You can sit in the dark.
Yeah, the film Quarry consists or describes in a way two very extreme interiors, and describes it through a journey of a specific material, of marble, which you see here also from which is a quarry on one side, and then the second half of the film is describing showrooms of luxury condos in Manhattan.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what was in a way just being discussed, the sort of speculative development that's become kind of par for the course for many international architecture practices in terms of having a sort of status symbol luxury tower that gets built. And, you know, the degree of involvement of what I liked this term, signature architect, is obviously ranging in terms of, you know, how involved the architect is, especially in things coming down to material choices, as the buildings often go into a kind of state of financial remission sometimes, and as the original developers get over leveraged, and then new partners come in and buy in, and then substitutions are made. So, you know, that's a whole kind of process underneath that happens. But the main point being that there are these buildings that have just sprung up in the past 5 or 6 years in New York and continue, and it's become a main feature of the skyline. I mean, the most obvious being Vignoli's 432 Park Avenue, which is dominating the skyline now.
Yeah, what you see just here is basically the move into the buildings from the quarry into the showrooms. Maybe you can say something about the quarry first. Where is it? How did you find it? And how do we? Because I think for me it was very interesting how we started actually the discussions about this work
Right.
maybe 1.5 years ago or a year ago.
A year ago, yeah.
A year ago, and we actually started very much somehow in the frame of this discussion about the 1% and all these obscene towers that come up in Manhattan, maybe the Park Avenue building by Raphael Vignoli being the most obscene of all, but also a very good one, yeah, to a certain extent, a very good example. But
Yeah.
I think the film has very much changed its approach through maybe following a material and going to a quarry.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, your words like sort of obscene and things like that. I'm not sort of interested in rendering value judgments about it in that respect, and I don't think the project does either. But it does function in a way that we didn't discuss. I think that came up was in a sense the alienation of materials, or how materials, when mined from one place and taken into a form in another, then show a kind of alienation of substance, and then and also reflect a kind of investment in value or choice that gets played out in the spaces. For example, in the kitchen images you just saw. So these spaces that you're seeing now aren't the actual buildings that get built. They're one-to-one models of the apartments that are built into existing buildings, office buildings for the most part. And so a buyer would go and make an appointment and visit the sales gallery for the building that was made by the developer and the architect sometimes together. And they would see a model of the kitchen and the bathroom and sometimes the entire apartment. And they often have this kind of funny phenomenon of like two windows, which I don't know if you can see in this image, that there's a silver window and a gold window. And the gold is the one that is going to be the actual apartment, but the silver is the building that they've rented the space in to show their one-to-one model. So there's a kind of apartment inside another space that unfolds, and then there are renderings, and then there's, of course, my representation of it. So there's sort of multiple layers of images or of representations.
Which I think is incredibly interesting also in the context of this exhibition that took, as we said in our introduction, that took the one-to-one model as a point of departure in order to maybe make things more tangible and perceivable. But I think your film also hints at a very critical moment in a way in terms of representation, because it becomes very clear in your film that the one-to-one is basically a sales room. It's part of a larger economy of seduction, of simulation, because, for instance, what we see here, it's almost like a diorama.
Yeah, it's a panoramic projection of the actual view that you would get from that apartment, and it's showing you, now this image shows you that floor. It's sort of lit up, and it says, this would be, and the developers had drones photograph the so-called actual views that you would get if you bought on the 23rd floor or the 63rd floor and you were facing east or you were facing northwest, or, and then it sort of simulates, it in some sense simulates the view, which is part of what you're buying, that you're not buying the space so much as the view to elsewhere.
Yeah, the view.
Yeah.
I think you also did, as you told me, a lot of research also into the new technologies of simulation, which I think seems to make really a step forward these days.
Well, it's new and it's also old. Like that's a diorama. Like it's a tiny model that's about this big, and behind it is a light box with the view that apartment would have. So they're little tiny like dollhouse furniture, sort of like the Thorn rooms at the Art Institute of Chicago, this sort of historic representation of rooms in miniature. So there was sort of a mixture of things that felt, like I think that designers felt was very cutting edge and things that were sort of I don't know if retrograde is quite the right word.
How would you describe this work in the context of your other work? Because it seems as if you're introducing a lot of other media, other technologies, simulations. It seems to widen up a little bit what you did before, also the architectural works on the architects, for instance.
Yeah, I don't think of any of the work as architectural or having actually much at all to do with architecture. I think of architecture as a foil for other interests that the work is much more concerned with, that are visual, formal, and sociological. And so it's sort of, and when you said it's sort of the first layer, I can't remember exactly what you just said, but I think that's correct in the sense that I think that's, no pun intended, the entry into the work, is this kind of sense of an engagement with architecture, whether it's iconic Le Corbusier, or this this other kind of architecture that's present in New York right now. But it's sort of a foil, and when I say a foil, I mean in the sense of, the kind of photographer's foil where you place people over here because you want to photograph something over there, but you don't want anyone to know, so you sort of aim your camera and then you kind of turn that way when nobody's looking. And so everyone thinks that you're doing this, but in fact you're doing that. And that sort of kind of activity interests me quite a bit.
But when you say that architecture works or functions like a foil, does this also explain somehow the really surprising interest among many artists into architecture? That is architecture something that makes society more tangible, or a society which usually and political decisions and structures that have a tendency to be invisible, intactile, and less obvious? Is architecture also something that in that sense could work as a foil?
I mean, I can only speak for myself.
You should.
But I don't.
You can't speak on behalf of all the artists, but it's of course
God, no.
something. It's an interesting phenomenon, at least, that architecture has this position, which is, I think, probably beyond the discipline of architecture, which is also something I'm interested in regards to this exhibition, because it's not trying to be an exhibition for a particular discipline or group of experts.
Right. I don't know. I mean, this might be off topic in some way, but it's interesting to think about its role as a kind of visual, just such an intense visual phenomena, which is sort of somehow unavoidable, especially if one is working with a kind of direct means of photography or film or that sort of thing. But on the other hand, at least my interest in it has to do with a kind of canon, like an understanding of the canon of architecture, and using that almost like quotation, or in referencing a kind of a dominant acceptance of a genealogy of what is our understanding of culture, and then how that can be kind of upturned a little bit, or subverted, or at least looked at in a different way. And this kind of ridiculous overdetermination of all artists or that so many artists are interested in the failure of modernism as a utopian. I mean, this is really a kind of lack of imagination, I think, on the part of writers and critics to really engage in the works and what they're doing formally. Because, of course, what they're doing formally is, at least for me as an artist, the first and foremost, concern. But in relationship to this work, I'm always really most interested in a way in montage, and what happens when you bring things together, and the sort of third thing that gets born between the juxtaposition of two things, and in this instance, it's really the quarry and those materials, and then this kind of their high-end destination, which feels so uncanny when you go from this kind of massive room of marble which is in a cave, which feels like a kind of original shelter in the sense of, living in caves and early practices of shelter. And then into these spaces which feel so sort of highly alienated. Both the material itself is alienated and we are in a way. And the spaces are so removed, and the function of the skyscraper is as a sort of space of removal, yet allows a view, and all those things sort of come into question.
Mm. It's also quite clear that it's almost as a structure within the film, it's almost mirrored. It's between the Quarry situation and the showroom in Manhattan.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's not a remake.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that the second half remakes the first half, but it restarts, and it restarts in the same way. And it uses, the music restarts again. So you go through the music all over again, or at least the first sort of part of the music. And, it comes, one thing that I noticed within these, are we not moving anymore? I feel like we're always on this one image, but one thing I noticed in the showrooms was, of course, or the sales galleries, sales models, is how much like a film set they looked. And to me, I'm immediately, of course, aware of that. And sometimes I would go sort of behind the scenes or, backstage, as it were, and it would be literally a space that had 5 more feet above it, and they had dropped the ceiling, or they had, there was this whole kind of back of house feeling that was very tight and small. And I think in this kind of returns in the piece, in a way through the music, which is an odd thing to say, but the sort of use of Holst's The Planets and the relationship I feel between someone like Bernard Herrmann, who scored for Hitchcock, and Hitchcock as a kind of proto-studio filmmaker who was interested in matte paintings, which is like the earliest version of architectural renderings I can think of. These kind of like gorgeous matte paintings that they would make for, Vertigo or, so many of the Hitchcock films. I'm trying to think of the one in New York, or well, even Torn Curtain in Berlin, where you get all those matte paintings of Berlin that don't actually match up. But that sense of a kind of fantasy space drop behind, like another fantasy space that's one-dimensional, drop behind a 3-dimensional model that's one-to-one, that's used as a kind of space of representation.
I think the space of representation beyond the aspects you just described is also apparent to me, at least in the economy of those spaces, of the showrooms, and of the buyers, because as far as I know from you, they don't really live there. Or is it a representation of living, of housing? Many of them, it's probably their second or third home, or what kind of clients are we talking about?
I mean, we heard earlier about the sort of idea of the dominant idea of the whole building itself is made to make money, but it's also an investment for the buyers in many respects, at least in the buildings that I looked at and are featured in this. And in that sense, sometimes they're unoccupied, or they've been called in the press like high-end safety deposit boxes, or sort of a new Swiss bank account. And there's also been articles about, what is the money that is, where does that come from, and what are we complicit in by allowing this? But anyway, but that sense of the apartment, as a kind of investment space, and they're also often bought by people who have multiple homes. So, whether they're there or not, I have no idea. But they're not in the film, and I think that's the important analog. Is like they're not present in the work.
I think the only humans that are visible in the film are the workers in the quarry. So.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple humans in the renderings.
Maybe coming to the second project before we open up to discussion, to the love letters. The artist book that Amie developed for this exhibition, which points to a very different situation, but of course very much connected through the topic of housing, but a different clientele.
I'm sorry, can we, in the PDF, can you go to a 2-page view? Because if you go to a 1-page view, it's sort of pointless, but if you go to, you know how you can choose, that would be great, thank you.
Yeah, love letters, maybe you can briefly explain how it started and what this project is about, because it's a very different angle. We were probably talking, very boldly talking, that the previous project was about the 1%. Now it's in the middle of a process of what is usually called gentrification.
Yeah, well, so love letters came about out of an interest that I've had in the neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is called Bed-Stuy, which is a part of Brooklyn that is being so rapidly gentrified that it's quite remarkable. And a love letter, as I found out, is a letter from a potential buyer of a home, in this instance a brownstone, to the seller that goes through the real estate agent, or sometimes gets dropped in their mailbox, you know, their letterbox, where they describe themselves and their family or their, you know, partner or whomever, their life, and they also describe what they like about the home, and they sort of, the effort in the love letter is to somehow convince the buyer to place their bid above others, even if maybe they don't have the financial means to win, you know, the purchase of the home, in the sense of, you know, it's a market where there are so many bidders on properties that there's going to be a kind of bidding war often. And so the idea is that they're going to offer something about themselves that'll be so worthwhile, or their understanding of the home that they're buying. But love letters actually came to, I came to expand that to, once I started researching this project and getting in touch with the real estate agents and buyers and sellers, I realized that, in fact, there was a massive kind of targeted harassment. I think that's the word that members of the community told me that they used most often, and that's what I heard it described as, where real estate agents would drop letters into their boxes as well, and postcards and all kinds of things, trying to solicit them to sell their home, or if they did sell their home, to get in touch with them. And the community that I'm speaking of is, you know, Bed-Stuy became, after the Depression in the US in the 20s and early 30s, Bed-Stuy became the second largest African-American population in New York, Harlem being the first. And it's a very proud community with an intense, also bohemian history that is almost like a little competition with Harlem. And so that's the community that are the current homeowners, and they were buying up property during and after the Depression, and when many people who were current homeowners couldn't afford their homes, and it's a neighborhood that is almost all brownstones and discussed as stunningly beautiful brownstones with a kind of very thought out layout around parks, etc. That's the community of sellers in this instance, who are getting phone calls every day, who are getting emails, who are getting letters, who are getting postcards dropped in their letterboxes, trying to convince them to sell their homes because, you know, the realtors want to flip them multiple times. So this, for example, is a postcard that I found that a resident gave me that had circulated. And all of these letters are juxtaposed in the book. So on, you know, the one page, on the left page you have the letters, and on the right page you have family photographs from the residents, or the longtime residents of Bed-Stuy. So the research for the project was, as you can imagine, quite intense, and involved not just contacting realtors and potential buyers and sellers, but also long-term members of the community, and using this kind of, in this instance, the montages, you know, between the soliciting letters and the photographs, which range from contemporary to, you know, historic, let's say. you know, in the past 70, 80 years.
How did you get access to the people, because it's a very private dimension also. So it's about the lives of people, that they gave you photographs.
Yeah, not easily.
And of course, on the other side, those who want to buy, I think when you read the letters, it's pretty compromising what you read in there, some of them.
Yeah.
How did you get access? It's in such a situation as an artist. How did you work?
Well, access is like 70% of what I do, unfortunately. But I'm sort of a deep believer in like if somebody says no to me, I'm like, I don't hear it, and I just kind of keep talking to them until we have a kind of relationship, and then usually that sort of morphs into an understanding that. It's really just about getting, I think, you know, when people really understand the terms of a project. Like, I mean, almost every person I encountered at first thought that I was trying to get something from them, which would be for them to sell their house so that I would profit from it in some way, because that's what they were used to in the project. But once they realized that the project would be this very complicated portrait of the community, they were most people were very interested. Of course, some people were just not, you know, but that's fine.
But I think it's a very different portrait than, let's say, the work by Martha Rosler about Greenpoint that you can see in the show, which is more based on interviews, transcriptions, and a rather documentary approach in terms of photography. Here, I think it's a very different dimension where you had to dig a bit deeper and also get the trust of people.
Well, I think also that
in a legal, because there's a legal dimension in this, and we're talking about money. Some parts are blacked out, which is also important to mention. Which parts are?
They're whited out.
Yeah.
It's a difference. Well, I mean, I didn't want this to become about individuals. You know, it was more about the phenomenon and how it manifests. And so I redacted certain names, you know, whited out people's names or identifying features because it didn't, you know, I'm not interested particularly in making a work that assigns blame, you know, so specifically. That would be uninteresting and unproductive, in my opinion. So. But there is also a sense of, I think that also unconsciously promotes a kind of sense of that there's something that's getting transacted that maybe shouldn't be. You know, it provokes a question around the nature of the transaction. And that's also very interesting. And then people would ask me to white out certain things. You know, I would talk to them about the letter and what did they want removed. What did they feel was identifying or too identifying?
I think what's interesting to me is that the work, Love Letters, doesn't, as you explained, doesn't really take a position that's too obvious and it's rather unromantic in a way.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say the Rosler does either.
Yeah.
But I do think that it performs a certain amount of exposition.
Yeah.
That this work doesn't. I mean, it's just going in a different direction. But I think that idea of exposition is really important in terms of a different approach.
I think that's maybe the opportunity to open up to the audience, opportunity to raise questions. Who has a question? Are there any questions? I can't see, basically. Probably not. Here. Franziska Bollerei.
Yeah, referring to the Quarry, why white marble and not Nero Assoluto or other stones? And why do you think that marble stands for luxury?
You know, the project began in a place where I was ultimately denied permission to film, which was 432 Park Avenue. And I was taken on a tour of the sales gallery in the Vignoli building, and there was a marble sink, and the marble sink was a solid block of marble from which the sink was a void, a sort of minimal void cut out of the solid block, and I was told that this super heavy block of marble had come from Carrara, and it came from the same quarry in which Michelangelo took the marble for the Davids. And I immediately understood everything in that moment of what was happening, but and I instead went to the quarries in Vermont, which is for the U.S. like the sort of Carrara of the U.S. and ironically is now owned. So the Danby quarries, which basically the marble for almost all of Washington and all the monuments, et cetera, that was its historic function, comes from Danby, and it was owned by the Proctor family, a very prominent political American family, and it was recently, in the past 10 years, bought by Carrara marble quarry owners. So it's run by the same company, which is really interesting, but it now, instead of functioning, it still provides much government marble, but it also provides, for the most part, what they're doing is Manhattan developments. It's a huge percentage of their activity, and so the sort of white marble seems to be an investment, a psychological investment on the part of the buyer, the developer, the designer, in some, I guess, notion of purity or a proximity to art.
Other questions?
Yeah, there's a question back there.
I'll ask that question again. There's this anecdote about Mies van der Rohe being challenged on the cost of the marble that he used as being this luxury material, and supposedly he said, well, actually, if you look at the life cycle cost, because it lasts forever, marble is the cheapest wall covering out there, much and it costs much less than wallpaper. And I used to work in New York as a metal fabricator on these super high-end jobs, and there was one project that was like a small hedge fund where the floors were stone that had fossils in them. And I remember thinking, like, we're installing these fossils which have been there for millions and millions of years, and they'll be here for a couple years, and they'll probably redo this or rip it out. And so it's like, it seems like all through, both like your projects, but then also the objects that you're looking at, there's this rhetoric of permanence and change and time scales, and then also there's these other ones that cause anxieties or cause, how does time and permanence and the appearance of time kind of work in this?
That's really interesting, thanks. Yeah, I've thought about it in relationship to the marble, because of course marble reacts really poorly to acid or acidic substances, and that people use it in their kitchen seems really interesting, like a kind of idea that you're going to want something precious in a workspace that could be damaged, because you're sort of saying, well, I could replace it, or I don't know, there seems to be some sort of other psychology at work, that marble has become such an important material for a space that we really think of as workspace, or at least is represented as such in the Martha Stewart world. But I mean, in terms of time, I think in all my work, I'm very interested in this kind of expansion and contraction of time and timelines. And I think part of it has to do with sort of sitting in front of, and I edit all my own work, and sitting in front of that kind of timeline and being kind of constantly confronted with the timeline. Maybe the way that, writers have their sort of like vertical page, but mine is this kind of horizontal phenomenon of like literally the editing software, and my interest in the tracking shot as a kind of representation of time. So this sort of parallel moving tracking shot, which is in much of my work, and this kind of, I don't know, shuttling along that timeline and where the materials go as well as, because the work itself is such a small slice of such a larger phenomenon of time. Like I can only represent a tiny bit of it. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it's interesting to think about it. I feel like you said this to me, though, about the marble, that the sort of weird, there's some irony about the sort of use of marble in that someone, if it wasn't you, someone was telling me recently, an architect, that the galleries in Chelsea and their sort of ubiquitous use of, in New York, their ubiquitous use of poured cement or poured concrete floors, that now if you're sort of searching for, I was told this, I don't know if this is true, I'm sure many in the room could say, that sort of poured concrete is more expensive than marble at this point because of its sort of, so it's sort of like what is costly is a psychological phenomenon, or it's something that comes up in terms of use and value.
Yeah, luxury industry is also something constructed,
right,
as we see.
Yeah, it's something that was once used to be sort of
marble
like ubiquitous.
Maybe it's a very effective material that, in fact, isn't so expensive. So the deal is quite good for developers, I guess. I think we have to move on. Thank you, Amie, for the presentation of these two works. I hope you will all have the opportunity to see the film. It's downstairs, and to have a look at the book, which we didn't have the opportunity to really see the two sides all together, because I think this is actually how the book is constructed. And yeah, thank you so much again for your contribution.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.